Hello, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to this session on improving physical and mental health. I'll be your chair for the afternoon. My name is Derval McDonough. I'm the CEO of Inclusion Ireland, and lovely to be with you here this afternoon. A warm congratulations to As I Am on the team for a wonderful conference so far, and we've got some fantastic speakers lined up for the next hour. Just a trigger warning at the start. Each of these presentations does reference suicide or suicide ideation, so we just want to give that trigger warning. That's also in your notes for this afternoon. If anybody is having a response to that or wants some additional support, there's As I Am team members just outside the door if anyone wants to leave and have a break. And we all know where the quiet spaces are as well within the venue, so please feel free to use those. So I'd like to welcome our first speaker to the stage. We have Rachel Moseley from the University of Bournemouth, and her paper is on suicidality in autistic people, a mixed methods approach to contributing factor. Welcome, Rachel.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming to listen to this talk. So I'm Rachel, and I'm going to talk about our recent research looking at the contributing factors that drove suicidal experiences in autistic people. So I want to start with some really unpleasant statistics. 1 in 4. That is the proportion of autistic people who will attempt suicide in their lifetime. And to put this in perspective, we believe that 1 in 37 non-autistic people will attempt suicide in their lifetime. So basically, this means that for every 1 non-autistic person who attempts suicide, 9 autistic people will attempt suicide. So to try and understand these awful statistics, many of us started off with the approach of trying to understand suicide in autistic people through the lens of theories and measures developed in non-autistic people. And we quickly realized this doesn't really work. So theories that are very effective and popular in non-autistic people work less well. They don't do such a good job of explaining suicide in autistic people. And measures designed in non-autistic people don't measure the same things in autistic people. And this really disadvantages autistic people, since interventions and policy is based on our theories and measures. So at the time when we began this work, there was no published scientific papers actually asking autistic people directly about the factors that contributed to their suicidal experiences. I'm delighted to see my co-speakers today, so we're going to hear a lot more about this. But this meant that we were really missing out on key information which can guide interventions and policy. So in this study, we designed a survey with community feedback where we wanted to find out from autistic people what factors contributed to their suicidal thoughts and feelings. And we asked them to rate the importance of 19 pre-entered factors. And then we asked them, you can enter your own text here, and we analyzed what they told us. So we had almost 1,400 participants, and they all had experience of suicidal thoughts and/or behavior. Primarily, they were all from the UK, they were mainly white, they were a highly educated group. And we wanted to look at differences between people of different genders, different ages, different degrees of experience with suicide. So we looked at differences between cisgender men, women, and trans and gender divergent participants. We looked at differences between participants who were under age 25, people in the 26 to 40 age bracket, people in the 41 to 55 bracket, and people aged 56 or older. And we looked at differences by suicidal experience. So 10% of our sample had just experienced kind of very brief, fleeting thoughts of suicide. 23% had experienced more prolonged, severe, intense periods of suicide ideation. 29% had made plans of suicide, and 38% had attempted suicide at least once. And when we looked at the importance ratings for those pre-entered factors, we found that the 5 factors that were rated as most important were hopelessness, feelings of worthlessness or failure, loneliness or feeling disconnected or alienated, mental health problems, and difficulties with friends and family. And the qualitative data gave us a lot more nuance and complexity. And I'm going to give you a really heavily summarized version here, focusing principally on that third theme, difficult thoughts and feelings. And we had multiple sub-themes here of difficult thoughts and feelings that underpinned suicidal thoughts, such as uncertainty about the future. So, for instance, fear of what will happen when I lose the structure of school, or if I lose my parents, how am I going to cope? Feelings of loneliness, separateness, alienation. So sometimes people were saying, I don't have any meaningful, caring, accepting relationships. And other times people were saying, I feel so different from everyone else, and I'm sort of disconnected by these feelings of difference. I feel so alien. We also had people saying they felt worthless, broken, ashamed, a failure. And sometimes these feelings came along with feelings of burdensomeness. I am a liability to those around me. I hurt other people. I'm no good for other people. I should leave. We also had people saying that they felt no meaning or purpose or point to their lives. And often they would talk about this in the context of, there's all these stressful things in my life, and there's not enough good to sort of balance that out. And a really overwhelming theme was people talking about how overwhelming life was. They were deeply overwhelmed. There was no way out. There was no escape other than suicide. So that feeling of overwhelm, exhaustion, tiredness, burnout. And what we found was that these feelings were inextricably linked with the other themes of our analysis. So you can see that the psychological profile of autistic people, so their cognitive, their emotional and sensory profile, in this quote here, is linked to those feelings of disconnection. So my sensory sensitivities make me feel disconnected from other people. In this one here, you can see that the common stressful and traumatic life experiences of autistic people, like being unable to access help, was linked to feelings of overwhelm and being unable to cope. And being undiagnosed emerged as a really strong theme, linked to feelings of brokenness, worthlessness, difference. Now, we found that the contributing factors to suicide differed by age and gender. So we found that our cisgender women and our trans and our gender divergent participants were more likely to highlight bullying, difficulties with friends and family, being unable to access help, physical and mental health issues, hopelessness, past trauma, whereas our cisgender men were more likely to highlight difficulties with romantic relationships, unrequited love. And this very much taps into what we know about autistic women and gender minorities, that they do struggle to access support and services, and they do tend to have poorer health and also higher rates of trauma. The differences we saw by age made a lot of sense. They were kind of as expected. So, for instance, we would expect our younger participants to be more worried about academic strains, and we might expect our older participants to be more worried about job difficulties. But a couple of things really stood out. First off, there were no age differences for things like loneliness, bullying, worthlessness, showing the ubiquity of these issues across the autistic population. And we also found that people in the 26 to 40 age bracket, they rated hopelessness as most important. more than the other groups. And that kind of reflects this drop-off we see in services and support. We found that the importance of certain factors appeared to differentiate between people with different degrees of experience with suicide. So rating bullying as very important seemed to distinguish participants who had made suicide plans and who had attempted suicide from all of our other participants. And we found that the importance of past trauma and being unable to access help characterized people who had attempted suicide, highlighting that these were really important issues for them. I want to highlight a few really important caveats. So this was cross-sectional data collected at one point in time, so we can't say that these things definitely caused suicidal experiences. And similarly, we're measuring the perceived importance of these contributing factors rather than actual exposure to these factors. So maybe someone never experienced bullying, or maybe they experienced it, but it wasn't very important. We don't actually know. And finally, our sample is unrepresentative of many autistic people, so that's important to say. But I want to end with a few implications. So in terms of risk formulation and safety planning, the findings really highlighted how fluid and complex suicidal thoughts and feelings are. They are underpinned by both inter- and intrapersonal factors, and these are all co-occurring and interacting with external stressors. We found that concepts from theories in the general population did seem to apply, so things like thwarted belongingness, perceived burdensomeness, entrapment, hopelessness, all concepts we know about from the general population. They apply, but they seem to be essentially coloured by the autistic experience, both the kind of psychological profile and also the common life experiences. So for instance, common experiences of bullying and trauma in autistic people might be augmented or worsened by the cognitive profile of having sticky thoughts, ruminating on things, and by isolation. And being undiagnosed was a really pervasive factor linked to suicidal thoughts. Now, we know that current best practice in the UK says that autistic people should have a full psychosocial assessment, which needs to identify both risk and protective factors, and that ties into what we found about some people pointing out, the lack of things that make my life worth living. Unfortunately, we've got some fantastic work led by Sarah Cassidy, I can't quite see here, but who has been developing adapted safety plans for this purpose, and so I've given you a link to that there. But these findings also show us that support needs to be age, gender informed. It also needs to be informed by any other intersectional identities that someone has. In terms of policymakers, I really want to highlight that trauma, victimization, and inability to access help were particularly associated with planning and suicide attempts. And this is a huge red flag for policymakers, given how many autistic people are in lack of support and how many are undiagnosed. On which note, I just want to finish with a quotation from the study. Historically, we've looked at suicide in autistic people as a psychiatric individual problem, but it's actually a social problem, a very understandable response to a world where people don't have equal rights to safety, dignity, autonomy, meaningful connections, enjoyment, and purpose. And many of the contributing factors in this study are entirely preventable, and that's really positive news. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was really, really interesting. Stands out to me the phrase, the ubiquity of loneliness is something that I'll take away from today. So just like to invite from the audience, we have time for a question or two if people want to come up and use the microphones at the front. And if not, we'll move on to our next presenter. I think this gentleman. Yeah. Oh.
Hi, thanks for your great presentation. I just wanted saying undiagnosed individuals, that's one of the main factors. how do you know that these undiagnosed individuals are autistic? Could there be something else going on there?
It's a great question. I think this is something that we all, very many of us, grapple with in autism research, isn't it? It was linking into, I think, one of the earlier, I think TC talked about this earlier, and so did Sue. It's really important to us to include people without formal diagnosis in our studies, because as has been said earlier, certain demographics have been marginalized and are less likely to receive diagnosis. You're absolutely right, though. It means that we were unable to validate you're definitely autistic and you're not.
But did you have other information on them? Did you have anything else that could inform you about this?
We asked people about their diagnosis when they received it, but we gave people the option to say, no, I don't, I'm waiting for assessment, or I self-identify, and we don't have anything more on to validate that, I'm afraid.
Thanks.
But I suppose it's relevant as well, because we often find that those who are undiagnosed have the higher suicide rates, and hence we need to include them.
That was really interesting. Thank you so much. I was just wondering if, in the line of your reading and research, you have any comments on suicide risk in younger people, so those under 18. Do they present with the same profiles?
Such a great question. There is research on suicide in autistic children and young teenagers. I have to say, our age limit was 16 here, and I haven't personally done research with children. What we know is that autistic children start to differ from non-autistic children in terms of the prevalence of suicidality very early on. Certainly by the time you're in that 10 and upwards bracket. And there's been some fantastic work. I would recommend maybe looking up the work of Jessica Schwartzman, who has done a lot of work on suicide in this younger population, but there's some other really good research out there.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to keep other questions to the end, unfortunately, because we're running out of time, but thank you for those contributions.